Do you have trauma? Does somebody you know or love, someone that is living with the effects of trauma? Wouldn't it be obvious? You would think that would be obvious, but you would be surprised. I'm going to share with you in this video the top 5 things that indicate that someone you know, maybe even yourself, is living with unprocessed trauma. Hi, my name is Valerie. I'm an intuitive energy healer and spiritual guide, and I help people who are living with the effects of trauma, PTSD, CPTSD, and their effects convert their lives from surviving trauma to a life that is thriving. I've made that journey myself, and I am here to share some information, tips, tricks, and healing modalities that have worked for me, and I hope they'll work for you. So what are the top 5 indicators that you or someone you know might be living with the effects of trauma? I wrote down 5 things here, and the first one that I want to talk about is emotional volatility. We can all lose it once in a while. People get angry, people get upset, things touch us and they bring emotions up. But what I'm talking about specifically is when the emotional response is way out of proportion to the actual events that are occurring. A really good example of this is something that happened a few years ago. I was staying with my son, who was really experiencing some difficulties at the time, and I was helping them, kind of get stabilized. And we watched a movie I guess it was a series on Netflix. It's called The Great, and it's kind of like a really fantastical, bizarre, semi-modern take on the story of Catherine the Great. And there's a lot, because of the era in which it takes place, there's a lot of violence. But it's also presented in kind of like a tongue-in-cheek, humorous way. We were watching this, and there's a part where Peter the Great gonna drown her. Sorry, there's a lot of mosquitoes here. Anyways, my kid reacted like had a complete and total meltdown over this, really lost their shit. Which, I can see anybody having a negative reaction to violence against women, but that was just a real touchstone for them right at that point. And it was a trigger. So I have another video that I did earlier. I'll post it at the end here. I'll link to it. About triggers and the difference between like PTSD and a physical trigger and an emotional trigger. And this is one of the signs that you may have unprocessed trauma, is because those triggers are in your body. They're wired into your brain. It's not just like in your head. It's not make-believe. You're not overreacting to the current situation. You're reacting to the past situation in which you were traumatized, and that was what was going on with Aeon. So they were having this reaction that was out of proportion for most people to just a scene on a show on a TV. Number 4 on the list of signs that you may be living with repressed trauma is the exact opposite of this: emotional deficit. And I can give you an example of this from my own life. I guess it was a couple of years ago I started dating somebody, and I should have been able to recognize and heed a lot of red flags that were going off for me. But because of my own childhood trauma, I had learned as a defense mechanism as a child to accept things that were not acceptable, to accept ways of being, ways of expressing, ways of treating people, a lot of things that are normally not, you wouldn't stand for it, right? You'd set a boundary and you wouldn't stand for that sort of behavior, or you would just walk away from the situation. Anyone else that didn't have that conditioning and that experience of trauma in their childhood probably would have maybe gone on a few dates with this guy, but really quickly figured out, like, oh, hell no, that's not safe. That's not sane. I'm staying away from that. But I had a deficit in the emotion of disgust. It's really interesting because I remember, several years ago, learning about, they talked about this wheel of these different emotions and these 10 or 12 or whatever it is, families of emotions. And one of them was disgust. And my response was like, that's not an emotion. I have so lacking in that I didn't recognize it as an emotion. So I had a complete flat affect deficit when it comes to that emotion of disgust. Well, if you think about it, disgust is a defense mechanism, as all of our emotions are. They're signals from our brains through our bodies that something needs to take place. Like fear as an emotion means you're in danger. Disgust means like, oh, this is not a safe situation. And as a result of that deficit, I got much more deeply involved in this relationship than I probably should have. Someone with my age and experience, and it took me a long time. Taken me over a year to process through and understand that this was my trauma being triggered, but instead of being triggered as like an over expression of emotion, it was a lack of emotion. And I was lacking that ability to recognize this as a dangerous situation because it's so mirrored the situation that I was raised in. So that's number 2. Number 3 on the list, I wrote down regression. You probably heard of regression. It can be like physical, it can be mental, it can be emotional, it can take on different forms. But I'll use again an example of something I talked about in an earlier video. There was an instance when my dad got mad at the dog because the dog wouldn't come. And so he took the kennel out of the car and put it on the ground and just told me to get in the car, and we just drove away. And any child, I think I was 10 or 12 or something, any child would be concerned and like, well, what are we doing? How are we going to just leave him there? What's happening? And he explained, well, we're just going to drive up the road a mile and come right back, and he'll be there when we come back. And it all worked out. But I completely regressed to the age of about a 2 or 3-year-old, which is when a similar trauma had happened to me. I didn't know that's what was happening at the time, but I can look back in hindsight and see that that's what was going on. I was regressing. So it could be an emotional regression. It could be a mental regression. There was a time, I was talking about that relationship that I got deeper into than I should have, as I was dealing with that, and the breakup was really awful. I I was so triggered that for a period of time, several weeks, and it really took me a couple of months to totally recover from it, I noticed that I couldn't function like an adult. Like my thought processes, I was mentally regressed and had difficulty working and doing my job. And I felt like I was about 14 years old. And I recall that it just brought to mind the trauma therapist that I worked with for many years. She could tell when I was starting to get into one of these triggered states, and she would always ask me, how old do you feel right now? So if you find yourself in one of these situations where you don't feel like connected and in touch, it's a sense when this regression takes place, you don't feel like you don't feel like you're really real and connected in the world that you're in. And it's because neural pathways from a different point in time are being activated. And it's really hard to come back into the new pathways that you formed, the adult pathways, when those childhood pathways are being triggered and functioning. But you can do it. The number 2 sign that you might be living with trauma is something called dyslalia, is losing the ability to speak. I've experienced this myself. And some of the trauma that I experienced was at such an early age that it was before I learned to talk. So I have had situations where, as much as I feel like there's something I want to say, I want to express myself, it's like, it's a horrible feeling. If you've experienced this, let me know. Put something down in the comments if you've experienced this. I'd love to share with people about this, because it's such a weird thing that, like, you literally can't get the words out. It's like the ability to speak is gone. And it comes back. It's passing, but it's very, very real, and it can be very, very distressing. The number 1 thing that should be a dead giveaway to you, that you or someone you know or love is really struggling with unprocessed, repressed trauma, is dissociation. Dissociation is when you literally unplug from the world. It's a little bit of that feeling I was talking about a minute ago, where you don't feel like you're real. You don't feel like the world is real. You don't feel connected. It's almost a dreamlike state. Again, like so many of the things that we experience as the symptoms of trauma, these are learned behaviors. These are learned defenses that we take on as children as survival strategies. And they helped us get through the worst. But when we go on into and become adults in life, they're no longer serving that function. And so it's good to be able to process the trauma and get through it. There's no way over or around it. You can't bury it indefinitely. You have to get through it. You have to let it out. Dissociation is, and I don't want to get too graphic, but for example, take a small child who's being abused physically or sexually or whatever, and they have no defense. They can't defend themselves, get up and run, fight back, because maybe they tried. But when they tried, it literally makes the abuse worse, because you've got this little person against a grown adult. Like, how can you defend yourself? And so the defense is to mentally escape, and you disconnect from your body and go into this, it's almost like an alternate reality, to literally shield yourself from what is happening in your physical body and in the world. I can give you a real quick example. When I was in labor and gave birth to my son, it was a very, very difficult labor. At the end, they had to do a really nasty procedure, and I was hemorrhaging, and I was losing a lot of blood. And at the moment where the surgeon had to reach inside of me, I know, awful, I literally popped out of my body, and I remember being up in the corner of the room looking down at myself and everything that was happening and the people in the room. That's an extreme example of dissociation. Oftentimes, after a period of dissociation, you won't remember it. You won't remember anything. And that's how it protects us. So these are the top 5 things I think would be really good indicators to look for that would help you to discover your unresolved trauma and perhaps lead you on a path of healing that trauma. As I mentioned earlier, I do energy healing, and I work with people who have experienced trauma. So if you're interested in finding out more about that, I'll leave a link to my website down in the description. And I'd love to hear from you. I would also love to hear your comments. Share with me if you've experienced any of these things. And love to know what you think of the videos and if there's topics that you'd like for upcoming videos as well. I plan to share more tips and tools of coping and helping to remove your blocks and overcome your symptoms in future videos as I have in the past. So check out some of my other videos if that's something you're interested in. If not, just give it a thumbs up, appreciated. You can subscribe and hit the bell to get notifications. I post about once a week, and I look forward to seeing you in the near future. Thanks for joining me. Peace.